It's Piercing Jewelry Basics number 5. We're going to talk about most common gauge used for piercing ears. Coming up next on Body Piercing Basics, episode number 148. For those who are new to the channel, welcome to the Body Piercing and Tattooing channel. Hope you're enjoying the videos. Hope you're finding them helpful and useful, but you might not know who I am. My name is DaVo. I'm a professional body piercer and have been since 1994. I own and operate the Axiom Body Piercing Studio. Look at me right here in Des Moines, Iowa, inside Skin Kitchen Tattoo. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through some of the more common ear piercings and tell you what the common gauge or thickness each one of these is done with. If you haven't seen the video on gauge to understand what that is, maybe you should watch that. It's like 2 or 3 back. So let's start out with the ear with the lobe. 18 gauge is probably the most common size. Maybe smaller, 20 gauge in some cases. If you're thinking about stretching, you may start much larger, like a 14 or 12, or even up to 6 gauge. Helix piercings or upper ear cartilage, usually done at 18 gauge. Conchas, usually done at 16 gauge or 18 gauge. Generally, with that one, if you are planning on wearing a ring in it at any time, I really suggest piercing initially at 16 gauge because you have a much larger variety of jewelry to put in it. If you have really large ears, you may want to consider 14 gauge because you might need something even wider. Industrial piercings, 14 gauge is the most common. Floating industrials, basically the same thing. Rook piercings, 16 gauge, usually curved barbell. Yeah, those are fun to put the balls on, let me tell you. Shinman, I think that's how you pronounce it. This one could be at 18 gauge or 16 gauge. Usually 18 is probably the most common. Faux rook, 18 to 16 gauge. Vertical helix piercing, those are done at the top, or trident is one of the more popular combinations done with those. Usually with those 16, you can do them at 18 gauge. I've seen them done all the way up to 14 gauge, but usually 18 to 16 is that sweet spot. Forward helix piercings. This one's I really suggest doing at 18 gauge. You don't usually have a lot of room to work with, and having a very thick gauge in there would reduce the amount of room you have to work in. So 18 is probably the most common for that. Well, that brings us to the Daith piercing. 16 gauge or larger is usually what I suggest with this particular piercing. Usually circular to begin with, like a ring or a circular barbell. Personally, I like circular barbells just basically because it makes the piercing of them a little less stressful for the piercer. Tragus. With this one, you're kind of going back to that ring thing again. 18, if you're just going to stick with studs. 16 would be a better option if you want to get rings. Though, for as small as you need, there's a lot of 18 gauge stuff out there. Snug, 16 gauge. 14 tends to be a little too heavy and take up a little too much room, which will increase the likelihood of rejection, which this piercing is really prone to. Not a fun piercing to heal out, really. Faux snugs can be done at 18 or 16 gauge, usually 18 gauge. The anti-tragus, it's very anti-healing in most cases. They can be a more difficult piercing to heal also. These 18 to 16 gauge, I think it's more common to see these at 16 gauge, especially if you're using curved barbells. Conch to conch industrial, 14 gauge all day long. Translobes, usually 16 gauge or thicker. I've seen them done at 14. I've always done them at 16 gauge. However, sometimes it's hard to find a long enough post, especially if you have big earlobes in that smaller gauge. So you have to go with a slightly thicker piece just to get the piercing done. Hidden helix and hidden rook. Both of them are done with 18 or 16 gauge. Usually Lobe stud with some fancy end that appears to be floating. And the last one, a good old cat flap. This one's done with usually 18 to 16 gauge. Well, did I miss one? If I did, leave a comment. Next one, we're going to go into facial piercings and oral piercings and go through those. And then we'll move on to torso and genitalia. Till next time, here's hoping all your piercings heal with ease and without a single issue. And if you're in the Des Moines, Iowa area, I hope to see your body piercing needs in the future. Have a good day, everybody. Take care, and we'll see you in the next video.